So excited to have all of you here. I am Louisa Bissett, the Executive Director of the Associates of the Boston Public Library. Thank you for joining us, everyone here in the room and everyone watching from home on your computers. Thank you for joining us. This is our 20th anniversary, and we are just so excited for tonight's program. Like I said, we're very proud of them. To date, they have published or have forthcoming 80 titles. So we have a few alumni in the room. I hope you'll stand up and be applauded. Now, it is my great pleasure to call to the stage our wonderful board chair, Alyce Lee. If she wasn't busy enough being our board chair, this year she took on being co-chair of the Writer-in-Residence Committee along with Yssis Cano-Santiago. So thank you, Alyce.
So good evening, everyone. Tonight, as you know, we are celebrating 20 years of the Associates of the Boston Public Library's Writer-in-Residence program. 20 years of welcoming emerging writers into the Boston Public Library and fostering their literary creativity and many times launching their professional writing careers. And that changes their lives forever. As many of you know, the Associates of the Boston Public Library is an independent nonprofit dedicated to the promotion and preservation of the special collections and the BPL's historic, literary, and artistic treasures. We've also been the creator and underwriter of a wide array of programs and events, such as this Writer-in-Residence program. The program provides an emerging writer with financial support, a dedicated office within the library for a year, and additional coaching and editing services. All of this to assist the writer in having a document, a finished story, a finished book by the end of the year. 20 years ago, the newly created residency ignited a spark. Someone with that rare ability to see hidden potential decided to invest in this program, hoping that with the right resources and guidance, the program would flourish. The Associates Anonymous Investor is passionately committed to fostering the creation of new children's and young adult literature, and her continued engagement and strategic investment in the program have enabled the Associates and the Writer-in-Residence Committee to build a thriving and prolific community. It is my pleasure to announce that this year, the investor has provided the funds to more than double the writer's stipend to $50,000 for the year. It's not in my notes, but I've spoken to this anonymous donor, and she is committed to writers having the opportunity to having a living wage or getting somewhere close to it and being able to practice their crafts. We're incredibly grateful to our investor and her leadership and her generosity, which all makes this possible. One wonders if Alan Andres had any idea what he was getting into when he agreed to chair the Writer-in-Residence Committee in 2003, and he's chuckling a little over there, so I know he did not know. Alan served in this role with an unwavering commitment for years, transforming a great idea into a well-oiled machine that is now the Writer-in-Residence program. The Associates thanks Alan for his passion, his loyalty, and his unbelievable dedication to supporting emerging writers. Alan, would you please take a stand? He hates this, but there he is. He's also an amazing human being, and so I'm really happy to call you friend, Alan. Thank you. Alan has tirelessly worked to develop a community of writers, publishers, editors, booksellers, agents, and librarians who generously give their time and expertise to the Writer-in-Residence blind judging process. This year, Yssis Cano-Santiago and I became the co-chairs of this amazing group. We witnessed firsthand how Alan deftly works with these talented, knowledgeable people to carefully and thoughtfully weigh each proposal, looking for that hidden potential, just like our anonymous investor did all those years ago. On behalf of the associates, thank you to our committee, our co-chairs, our judges, our talented alumni, and to President of the Boston Public Library, David Leonard, and the Boston Public Library for working with the associates to give these emerging writers the space to create new work that inspires young readers. Now it is my pleasure to call Elaine Dimopoulos to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Dimopoulos, and as you heard, I had the honor to serve as the 2010-2011 Associates of the Boston Public Library Writer-in-Residence, and I'm now a proud member of the Writer-in-Residence Committee. It is my great pleasure to introduce this year's outgoing Writer-in-Residence, Danielle Emerson. Danielle is a Diné writer from Shiprock, New Mexico on the Navajo Nation. She spent her residency writing Shiganda Told from Home short stories, a young adult anthology of varying length short stories that include themes of grief, community, queerness, tradition, and identity. She has an immense gift at describing the complex yet enduring bonds between family members, and she writes with honesty and elegance. I've gotten to know Danielle a bit this year, and I want to acknowledge that she came into the residency already a wildly talented writer, but even so has constantly sought to improve her craft. This past year, in addition to completing her manuscript, she's attended workshops and writing conferences, shared her manuscript with mentors, and networked with literary professionals. Her work ethic and her drive distinguish her residency and convince us all that there are no doubt great things coming to her on her writing journey. Please join me in welcoming Danielle Emerson.
Yat Danielle Emerson in a share, class chit in the shle, Tatnazani a bashishi, Ado Ashihi a das bashiche, Tachi neda Chanelle, Natani nes a shigande, got ego edine adzan the shle. Good evening, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here and so grateful to see everyone else here. My name is Danielle Shantine Emerson. I am direct Chi clan, born for the Tango clan. My maternal grandfather is the Salt clan, and my paternal grandfather is Red Running Into the Water people. I am from Shiprock, New Mexico, and I am a Diné, or also known as Navajo woman. Before I start, I would like to pay respects to the people of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket tribes, though of course land acknowledgements aren't necessarily the only way that we can acknowledge Indigenous presence or scholarship or excellency, but we're gonna do it. This is the most that we can do at this point. There are communities that are living and resisting presently. We also give honor to the land itself, which was stolen from and remains sacred to the Massachusetts and Pawtucket people. So during my time at the library, I worked on a heartfelt collection of young adult short stories, as you heard, detailing the Navajo life and culture. Each story is heavily influenced and inspired by a unique image, dream, name, and or memory, drawing from a place of home, wherever that may be. My inspiration for this collection started with a need to heal and to combat Native and Indigenous erasure in published YA and children's books. According to the Cooperative Children's Book Center in 2022, 1.5% of children's books were written by Indigenous peoples. I grew up surrounded by my loved ones and my culture, but I didn't see books about and by Native peoples, especially not in school. I want to encourage and uplift positive representation of Native and Indigenous peoples, especially for younger readers in middle grade and high school. This need for support and care for my Diné community has always been my motivation for writing this short story collection. I will say that over the year, my plans for this short story collection sort of got a little upheaved, as two of the short stories I planned to include just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And at first, I did my best to cut them down or hinder their progress, but eventually I realized that those stories needed to be longer. And even though it shifted things around in my collection, those stories wouldn't be what they are now without my stepping back and trusting the process. I was asked to give some new advice to the new writer-in-residence, so after some thinking, I want to share the importance of stepping out of the office, of stepping back from the page and exploring the library. I didn't learn this till the end of my residency, but a mentor once told me, when you look away from something and then look back, there's going to be a change, because you're stepping back and then stepping back to the page with new emotions, new thoughts, and feelings, even if those feelings were fueled by a quick coffee break at the Newsfeed Cafe. So Yssis, I want to encourage you to build community in the library in Boston, and while the office is a great napping spot, try spending some time exploring. Before I start my reading, I want to thank so many people for supporting my writing: my mom, my late father, my younger siblings, Truman, Taylor, and Sarah, my Aunt Angie and cousins Nina and Arvin, who are all watching currently from New Mexico, my Aunt Lou and my cousin Kim, who are also watching. I also want to thank my friends for being here, Lainey, Shandine, Lynn, and Sean. I also want to thank my close friends, Michael and Rosalind, for all those years in either high school or undergrad, sitting with me, writing, and listening to me complaining about writing. Thank you to my partner Nathaniel for encouraging and uplifting my writing, especially as we figure out life together. Thank you to my previous mentors, Professor Rick Moody, Laird Hunt, Emily Hipchen, and Sarah D'Angelo. They all saw promise in my work and provided so much support. And finally, thank you to the associates of the Boston Public Library for providing such an amazing opportunity that will continue to support so many amazing writers in the future. I will now start my reading. So this is a short excerpt from a short story titled Nejone, means beautiful. Nejone and her brother didn't come prepared. They forgot to bring water, their clothes were too exposed, and nobody had mentioned sunscreen. The walk took forever. They walked in a straight line, stepping over dry weeds and bunches of miniature cacti. The clear sky hurt Nejone's eyes, forcing her to squint past choppy banks. She could feel the heat from the hot sand through her shoes. If they stood too still for too long, no doubt their feet would burn. Nobody wanted to carry the urn. It was heavy and warm in Nejone's arms. When you're the oldest, you're automatically the urn carrier. She had to keep shifting it from her left arm to the right, then from her right arm to the left. Nejone did her best to keep the sides from grazing her wrist, but it still stung. Everything stung. Her feet stung, her arms stung, the back of her neck stung. At the top of the rocks, Nejone undid the urn. The plan was to pour the ashes over the edge of the sandstone cliffs and hope it fell downward. But it turns out cremated ashes are bagged. Nejone and her brother didn't know that. They thought, like most people probably did, that the ashes were poured into the urn as it was, as ashes and nothing more. Nejone tried not to focus on how weird this was, tearing your father's plastic cremation bag. The ashes got on Nejone's hands, but she didn't feel too weird about that part. The whole thing was weird because she didn't expect her dad's ashes to be bagged with a black zip tie, like a piece of trash. Once Nejone opened the bag, she attempted to pour the ashes over the edge, but it didn't work. The wind suddenly changed directions, and the ashes blew straight into her face, and a good amount got in her mouth. Nejone noticed, instantly, how pleasantly it didn't taste like anything. It was just rough against her teeth, like sawdust. Some part of her mouth, the part that housed memories and scars in its tissues, was reminded of the old pieces of clay she used to eat under her father's art table. She remembered swinging from leg to leg, reaching up with small hands to snatch pieces of fresh clay from his crow figurines, picking off claws and feathers and tips of crow beaks. Maybe her father's ashes actually tasted like clay. Some of it got in Nejone's hair, turning it stiff and clumpy. She was surprised by how much her hair felt like she just put on hairspray. It got all over her clothes, and no matter how many times she brushed off her pants and shirt, it wouldn't go away. The wind kept blowing it in Nejone's face, and her brother saw it all happen. For a moment, they were a little disgusted. They weren't sure how to react, but eventually Nejone made eye contact with her brother. Did that just happen? A moment passed, and the wind blew a couple of weeds into her eyes, and she did her best to brush them out of the way. Nejone's brother kept looking at her, and soon they were both laughing. They laughed so hard their chests started to hurt. Nejone laughed so hard she almost started crying, and she could also see it in her brother's eyes, the strange need to cry, but also laugh at the damn same time. Nejone couldn't breathe. Everything felt so fucking hilarious and sad all at once. Maybe that's what she should say in her father's obituary. So fucking sad and hilarious all at once. Their mother was just over the rocks, and Nejone was pretty sure she thought they were going crazy with all the insane laughter. Slowly, their laughter died down, and the jeune, hands on her knees, head turned down, muttered a slight Jesus Christ before returning her attention to the empty bag of ashes. She realized that those ashes and that urn didn't feel like her father. In her mind, he was already gone, long before she tasted his ashes, and long before she got the phone call. Not dead, gone. Together, Nejone and her brother walked back, meeting their mom halfway. The walk felt shorter, but the heat didn't really change. They scrounged around their old van for a couple of coins to buy a bottle of water before they realized they could buy snacks and drinks with her brother's EBT card. Nejone didn't feel comfortable using the EBT for junk food, but their mother insisted. Nejone didn't like thinking about her brother. She didn't like using his name. They had the same father, but not the same mother. But Nejone's mom didn't care. Family is family is family, is what she'd always say. Up until now, she hadn't considered how her brother felt, losing their dad at 15. This is a word that I always have trouble pronouncing. Some apathetic part of her didn't really care and convinced herself that just by being male and looking like him, the loss of their father didn't affect him as much, or at least not as much as her. Ever since her brother was old enough to walk, people always commented on how much he looked like their father. They pull out photograph after photograph, holding them in front of Nejone's face in a gesture that almost felt childlike. Look at your dad and your brother. Don't they look alike when he was his age? When Nejone was a little girl, she got stung by a wasp on the edge of her lip. It turned an ugly purple that refused to heal, and while it hurt like crazy, she loved the attention. Does it hurt? Oh, are you okay? Oh God, that looks bad. Ouch. Her looks were never compared to her father, and especially not her mother, who was said to be a local beauty that broke more hearts than she loved, turning down every guy that asked her out until she met her father and saw his gorgeous long braided hair. Nejone's mother named Nejone because it meant beautiful and harmonious in Dinebazad. But when Nejone grew up, she knew without anyone telling her that she was a disappointment. The old bee sting on her lip never really went away. Instead, it prickled and swelled whenever someone said her name with a raised brow or compared her brother to their parents. Nolan looks just like you. Oh, that's funny. He's not related to me, but we're still family. Watching her brother from the back seat, Nejone could feel the phantom pain now, twisting like her father's old pocket knife, a strange sense of jealousy, because even though Nejone was covered in the remnants of their father's ashes, she didn't feel any closer to him. In the passenger side mirror, Nejone watched as their mother tended to a bad sunburn, noting how her arms looked as red as the rocks they walked over that day. Thank you.
So who am I and what am I doing up here accepting this wonderful manuscript? Good evening. I'm David Leonard. I'm the president of the Boston Public Library, and it is my privilege to welcome you all to your library. We started a tradition that at the conclusion of the Writer in Residence year, we would accept into our collection. Tonight, this manuscript in its unpublished form, which we know at some point will be followed by its published form as well. So Danielle, once again, congratulations on your year, and thank you for entrusting us with this manuscript. Just a few words of greetings. Also, I want to congratulate the associates on an amazing 20 years of history of this program. And for those of you who are frequent attendees, you know this is one of my favorite programs of the year. Don't tell the other program organizers. But why? It brings together in a very special way the two things that library at its core are about: reading and writing. We read to be inspired to write. It is writing without which we would not have anything to read. But also, this celebrates emerging authors, and in particular, children's and young adult literature, which have a special place in opening the imagination of our youngest patrons, in helping them on their journeys of self-discovery and in claiming their place in the world. And so this may feel like just a book. It doesn't to Danielle, I know. But it is a special moment in the work of production, in the work of writing, in the creation of reading materials, and in the creation of library. This is all the more important today as books throughout this country and indeed the world are being challenged, especially the very books that are most needed by our youngest patrons. And so I will report to you that no books are banned here at the Boston Public Library. That the library is strong and that remains free to all, and that this relationship with the associates itself is a symbol of what libraries are about, a public-private partnership. Just as it was in 1848, we are supported by incredible donors, some of whom we know their names, some of whom we do not. And so tonight we celebrate that, and we will now move on to hear about the incoming writer in residence. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Congratulations to all of the readers and writers in the audience.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Autumn Allen, and I was honored to serve as the Associates of the Boston Public Library Writer in Residence in 2020 to 2021, which, as you remember, was a pandemic year, so I didn't get the office, but I'm not bitter. I am so pleased to introduce this year's Writer in Residence, Yssis Cano-Santiago. Yssis has a background in public health and foreign affairs and is a Puerto Rican and Mexican writer. But I want to talk about how we just were so thrilled to read the section of the story that we read on the final judging committee this year. She's going to spend her year working on her young adult novel, A Hypochondriac's Guide to Love, which tells a story of two Latinx teens coming of age in 1990s Miami as they grapple with mental illness, racism, gentrification, and loss. There were a record-breaking number of applications this year, and Yssis's work stood out among the impressive list of finalists as a meaty story that would really take its readers on a journey, make us think deeply, and possibly transform us. Her writing sample showed both skill and profound sensitivity, and I am quite possibly her most eager fan. We can't wait to see how your work will turn out and evolve over this year, and we are honored to be a part of your journey. Please join me in welcoming Yssis Cano-Santiago.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Autumn, for that lovely introduction. I want to start by thanking my wonderful mother in the audience tonight. She instilled in me at a young age a deep love of words and knowledge, and I wouldn't be here standing before you all without her unconditional love and support. I would also like to thank my brother Constantino, my boyfriend Sam and his parents, my abuela who's back home in Orlando, my titi and tío in Maryland, my mentor through the Las Musas book mentorship for unpublished Latinx writers, Lake and Zaya Kemp, Page 15, an Orlando-based nonprofit writing organization that believed in my writing even as a high school student. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank Louisa, Laura, and Vidisha, and every member of the Associates of the Boston Public Library for this incredible honor and opportunity. I am beyond excited to serve as the 2024-2025 Writer-in-Residence for the Associates of the Boston Public Library. I look forward to spending the year strengthening my novel, learning more about my characters, and further exploring this beautiful space. Tonight, I will be reading an excerpt from the first chapter of my young adult novel in progress, A Hypochondriac's Guide to Love. My novel is set in 1990s Miami and follows Tennessee Betancourt, also known as Ten. She's a young Puerto Rican artist who suffers from illness anxiety disorder, also known as hypochondria. And when we first meet her, she is on a flight home to Miami after dropping out of her first semester at New York University. I started dying at the age of 8. The day Mama died, I'd been the one to find her. She was slumped across her bed, her caramel skin turned ash gray, her two-toned lips a royal purple. Her pupils a mere pinprick, like a single dot of black in a sea of brown. But it was her hands I fixated on, covered in splotches of blue and white oil paints from the piece she never finished. I reached for her hand, and when we touched, it was as if my bones ground to a halt and my world lost all color. The night after Mama's funeral, I tossed and turned in bed, trying not to see her face. My thoughts remained on the words my relatives whispered at the repast, where I'd stuffed my face with quesitos to avoid talking to anyone. She was so young, dos pobrecitos niños, her disease, it finally reached her heart. Hot bile rose in my throat, my stomach trying to claw its way out. I clenched my jaw and rushed to the toilet, my nails digging into the porcelain as I retched up quesitos en arroz con gandules. I wiped my mouth and focused on the unsteady beating of my heart. What would it feel like for the beating to stop? Would it be like the tight feeling of holding your breath underwater, your lungs screaming for air? Or was it more like skinning your knee, the pain burning but lasting only for an instant? Tick, tick, tick. My muscles tensed and a cold chill ran up my spine. It was the first time, but not the last, I'd ever hear that voice. Whether it was a simple flutter of my heart, an itchiness in my throat, or a pounding in my head, I was forced to wonder if it could be something more, something fatal. Up until now, the voice had been wrong about me having AIDS, lymphoma, multiple sclerosis, Lyme disease, and rabies. But one day I'll be right, the voice slithered in my ear. It's just a matter of when. Tennessee Betancourt, the annoyed flight attendant, held out my boarding pass, jerking me back to the present. I took it with a curt nod, careful to avoid accidentally brushing my hand against hers, afraid she'd see the patches of dry skin on my palms. Either from excessive hand washing or eczema caused by a potential autoimmune disease, I wasn't sure. I stood close to my gate and read my boarding pass, grateful to have been given a window seat. Not because I cared to look outside, but because I could control the window shade and prevent the strong UV rays from turning my healthy skin cells into melanoma. I looked past the gate to a nearby bar, my mouth filled with saliva as the bartender poured what looked like a rum and coke into a tall glass before topping it off with a lemon wedge. As the bartender handed the glass to a man dressed in business attire, I imagined the cold, fizzing drink in my own hands. My fears of dying an agonizingly slow and painful death, along with the shame I carried for dropping out of college after just one semester, faded into background noise with each sip, eventually settling at the bottom of the empty glass. I tore my eyes away from the bar, bouncing my leg up and down, and reached into my pocket for my needed eraser. I wasn't that person anymore, the one who needed alcohol to suppress the hyper-awareness of my body. I had medication for that now, along with coping mechanisms. I rubbed the eraser with my thumb, letting the sensation of grinding it into a pulp redirect my anxiety. Now boarding flight AA1032 service to Miami, I tucked the eraser away before gripping the handle of my suitcase, the only thing I brought with me to NYU before following the other passengers. Upon finding my seat, I pulled the window shade down, buckled my seatbelt, and cleaned my hands with a wet wipe before reaching into my backpack for my headphones and Sony Walkman. Bypassing my NYU sweatshirt, sketch pad, and Mama's gouache paints, my fingers traced the spine of a 2-pound gray hardcover book, the one thing I should have left in New York. I clutched it with the same desire for reassurance I had when I first discovered it in the gloomy reference section of the public library when I was a kid. As I placed the hefty book on my lap, it triggered an involuntary reflex in my knee, which I had to convince myself wasn't a sign of a nervous system disorder. I flipped to the one dog-eared page in the entire book into the only disease whose every symptom I could recite by heart. The old woman sitting next to me squinted at the heavy-set book and leaned in, within contagion spreading distance. I held my breath as she scanned the title, A Complete Guide to Human Diseases, A through Z. Are you in medical school? She asked with a thin-lipped smile. My niece is a doctor. I closed the book. Oh, no, heat crept up my cheeks. Nursing school then? She tried again. No, I'm dying, I said. She gasped in surprise and pity. To avoid further questioning, I placed my headphones over my head, planning to drown out my impending thoughts with Enrique Iglesias. For at least a 3-hour plane ride, I could pretend I wasn't the culmination of 3 adjectives: a college dropout, an orphan, and a failed painter. Not exactly in that order. But most importantly, I could pretend a telltale butterfly rash wasn't brewing underneath the surface of my skin, a sign that I'd inherited my mother's killer. Thank you.
Alyce had a wonderful idea. Can Yssis' mother stand? And it can, okay. That was a wonderful idea. Hello, I'm Alan Andres, former member of the Board of the Associates for the past 25 years, with, among other duties, overseeing the establishment and the functioning of the Writer-in-Residence program. In introducing our keynote speaker, Lois Lowry, I thought it might be worth noting how the beginnings of her career intersect with the Associates Fellowship and Boston's unique role in the history of book publishing and for children and young adults. In 1895, the Boston Public Library became the first public library in America to dedicate a room exclusively for books for children. By that date, Boston is already the home of book publishers Little Brown, Houghton Mifflin, and a popular magazine for children, Youth's Companion, which had more than 500,000 subscribers. 100 years ago this year, the Hornbook magazine was first published and is still with us here in Boston. When I hear the stories of the Associates' past and present Writer-in-Residence fellows and the difference the support and encouragement of our program gave them in their careers, allowing many of them to believe for the first time without a cringe of self-doubt, I am a writer of fiction. I think it's worth recalling the experience of a 38-year-old mother in 1975 living in southern Maine who had just published her first short story in an issue of Red Book magazine. Back then, Red Book, if you have to check Wikipedia to find out what that was, Red Book was the ubiquitous mass circulation magazine found in every supermarket and drugstore, and it published fiction. Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood, Ray Bradbury, Ward Just, Gail Godwin were all among the authors whose stories appeared in pages of the magazine in the mid-70s. As you'll have no doubt figured out, the author of Crow Call, one of the 6 short stories in that issue, was Lois Lowry, who then aspired to be a writer of adult fiction. That issue of Red Book came to the attention of a young children's book editor here in Boston, who wrote Lois Lowry a letter inquiring if she might consider writing a novel for young adults. Who can say if the book that resulted in Summer to Die, its reception, and the career it set in motion to some extent, would have occurred if that one enterprising editor had not serendipitously written that letter from a 5th floor office at 2 Park Street overlooking Boston Common. But that kind of encouragement at the right time could ultimately change lives. Our Writer-in-Residence fellows have now published nearly 80 different books, and they're now on library shelves since they were selected for our program. And who can forecast what lives those books are changing now when the pages are opened? So the story progresses. Nearly 2 decades after A Summer to Die was published from that brownstone office at 2 Park Street, Lois Lowry's second Newbery Award-winning novel, The Giver, was one of the last books published from that same address in 1993. Indulge me in a historical aside. Were this London, a blue historical marker would be hanging on that building, noting the fact that, as well as The Giver, Curious George, Mike Mulligan, Lord of the Rings, Handmaid's Tale, Silent Spring, The Things They Carried, Polar Express, and many, many others were published there. And, to give equal time, at 34 Beacon Street, 2 blocks away, there'd be another plaque celebrating the house that published Make Way for Ducklings, Arthur, Catcher in the Rye, Mr. Popper's Penguins, etc., etc. For Boston to play the role of the home of the only major Writer-in-Residence fellowship for emerging authors of children's and young adult literature, it only seems fitting. Despite the now vanished and once venerable Boston book publishers, there is still a vibrant children's book and writing community here. Simmons College, Hornbook remains, Candlewick Press, Charles Bridge, Barefoot Books, Noisy Crow Press, and others. And among the past judges for our Writer in Residency Award have been veterans from those former publishing houses, as well as from the newly thriving firms. Among them have been the same editor who wrote Lois Lowry back in 1976, and the later editor of her more recent books. On to the introduction. Recently dubbed living literary legend when she was featured on MSNBC's Banned Book Club with Ali Velshi, Lois Lowry is a mother and a grandmother, the author of more than 40 books of fiction, including the aforementioned The Giver, as well as Number of the Stars, the Anastasia series, the Tate Family series, and many others. Her books have been translated into more than 30 languages. A ragged paperback copy of The Giver was clearly visible in a press photograph of the Gitmo Prison Library. Several of her books have been adapted for film and stage, and one has become an opera. Born in Hawaii, she grew up in Japan, Pennsylvania, and New York, attended Brown University and the University of Southern Maine, and currently divides her time between an 18th century farmhouse in Maine and West Coast Florida. So, please join me in welcoming someone whose work Alice Hoffman has noted has a forthrightness and honesty that provides a moral center in a complex and confusing world. A generous, gutsy, singular woman who reminds us that books and love and memories are all that matter. The legendary Lois Lowry.
Thank you, Alan. I do not have a prepared speech. I have a list in my hand. I thought about libraries and literature, and I started chronologically addressing those two things and how they've affected my life. And the first thing I did was to look up the public library in the small town where I spent my childhood. I had been born in Honolulu. My father was a career Army officer, that's why we were there. And then when the war began, my mother was expecting a baby. My father had to go off to the Pacific, and so my mother took my sister and me back to the small college town in Pennsylvania where she had grown up and where my grandparents lived. That town, of course, had a public library. It still does. The name of that library is the J. Henry Bosler Library, and I think a man named J. Henry Bosler gave the money zillions of years ago to create that library. But I looked it up online yesterday, and I read this. This was its original description. Books could be borrowed for 2 weeks, 2 books at a time, provided they shall not both be fiction. Patrons had to be persons above the age of 12 years, of cleanly habits and good reputation. This was the library in the town to which I was taken when I was 5 years old. And that library, although I was taken dutifully every Sunday morning to Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church, the library became my cathedral. I have remembered it all my life as a magnificent building with 100 marble steps up which I would trudge. And I'm startled by this rule that you can't take more than 2 books at a time and only one can be fiction, because I remember coming down those steps with my arms full. I could walk to that library from grandfather's house. Libraries then, of course, were quiet places. One was in awe of them and of the librarian, who was behind a desk about this height so that I would have to stand on tiptoes and place my books in front of her. And she would do something that was so mysterious to me with my books. I didn't know what that was, but when I was at home in the bedroom that my sister and I shared at grandfather's house, I would line up my dolls and stuffed animals and I would play librarian. I would, from our storehouse of books, because we had many, I would look at one and say to the lined up animals, "Bunny, I think you might enjoy one about ice skating." And then I would take it and I'd go and hand it to a stuffed rabbit. For some reason, that was a game I never tired of. My sister, older, 3 years older, would roll her eyes. When I made this list, I started out with age 8 to 10, and what I was reading then and what my book life was at that time. And on each of these chronological labels, I seem to have put 3 words that would remind me what I wanted to say about that time period. And so under age 8 to 10, I have library, and I've just talked about that library, which incidentally, I went back to that town and spoke at that library some years ago and discovered it was 10 cement steps. It was not 100 marble steps. But in addition to library, I also have listed Grandpa. My grandfather lived in a house into which I moved as a child for that duration of the war that had a room called the library. It was a big house. My grandfather was president of a bank. The library had a wall of bookcases, glass-fronted. Grandpa would open the glass door of a bookcase with great solemnity, would take one out, and he would invite me to sit on his lap, and he would read aloud to me. Rudyard Kipling. That was appropriate for my age, but not everything he read to me was appropriate for my age. It didn't matter. And I remember him reading, I remember this because he read it so often when he realized it fascinated me, a very long poem by William Cullen Bryant. It was called Thanatopsis. A section of it went like this: as the long train of ages glide away, the sons of men, the youth in life's green spring, and he who goes in the full strength of years, matron and maid, the speechless babe, and the gray-headed man shall one by one be gathered to thy side by those who in their turn will follow them. So live that when thy summons comes, I'll stop there. It's a poem about death. I didn't know that. I didn't care. I loved that listing of the people, the gray-headed man. That was my grandfather, the speechless babe. It wasn't me, but it might have been my doll. What meant so much to me was the man who held me and read those words. As I leaned my face against, he always wore tie and vest and jacket, the tweed of his jacket, my legs hanging off of his knees. And I watched as he read and saw how much he loved the words. And I began to love the words as much as I loved the man. The third, each of these years has a list of 3 things. And it makes me think of when you reach my age, which is 87. When you go to the doctor for a checkup, they ask you to remember these 3 words. It makes me think of that. But the third thing on this first list is Jack and Jill magazine. That was a children's magazine that someone had given me a subscription to. And in 1947, when I was 10 years old, they published a letter that I had written to them. And some enterprising graduate student found that magazine, sent me not the whole magazine, but a Xerox copy of those 2 pages, Letters from Children, August 1947. Just to give you a glimpse of the kinds of letters that were on those 2 pages so you can appreciate mine fully, was one from a little boy in Wyoming. It always said the child's name and then the state. So I don't remember his name, but he was from Wyoming, and it said in its entirety, "They are building a new driveway across the street. I watched the steamroller go up and down and up and down." Okay? Mine, which had, and it gives the child's age too. Mine has my name, age 10, Pennsylvania, and it says, "I am writing a novel." It's called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. I have no memory of that, but I don't think it was a lie. I was always writing a novel. I knew by then that that's what I wanted to do with my life, to use words to create things that would cause people to, like my grandfather, savor them. At the end of World War II, when my father returned home, he could stay only briefly. He had to go back to Japan, to Tokyo, where he would be on the staff of the Tokyo American Hospital. And after a while, we were able to join him there. So the 3 words that I've placed in that 1947 little list are bicycle typewriter and Ernie Pyle. When we arrived in Japan, in Yokohama, by ship, having gotten on the ship in New York, gone down through the Panama Canal up to San Francisco to collect more passengers, and then across the Pacific, it was a month on the ship. My dad met us in Yokohama, and driving us to Tokyo, where we would live, he whispered to me, he said, "I've got a surprise waiting for you." And the surprise was a bicycle. I had just turned 11 years old. I was about to enter 7th grade. Tokyo in those days, and this is still true, it's very different now, of course, but in those days was a very safe place. And I could get on that bike and did, and ride around by myself, the way I had in my little college town in Pennsylvania. I would leave in the morning and my mother wouldn't see me again until it was time for dinner. And Tokyo was such a wonderful place to explore, to think about, to wonder about. It had been decimated by the war. But some buildings, of course, were still standing, and I could get off my bike and stand with a crowd of Japanese people who would line up every morning on the sidewalk outside the Daiichi building as a car drove up and General MacArthur got out and went into his office. And all the Japanese people would bow as if he was a god. I would bow with them. What the heck? MacArthur, he was not a friend of my parents, but my parents knew the MacArthurs. They had a son who was my age. He did not attend school. He was tutored at his home. But there was a list that had been made of acceptable playmates for Arthur. And I was on the list. But Arthur never chose me. It didn't matter. But that bicycle was such an important gift to me, and it was followed on my 13th birthday, which was in March of 1950. We didn't know this, but soon the Korean War would begin and the casualties would be coming in to my father's hospital. But this was March before that happened, and it was my 13th birthday, and my father gave me a typewriter. That seems ordinary now that every kid, including my grandchildren, has computers by the time they're 10. But in 1950, a typewriter was an extraordinary gift. And I've always been grateful to my father for, he was a taciturn man, Norwegian immigrants for parents. Of course, Norwegians never express any emotion. But giving that very expensive, meaningful gift meant that he knew who I was and who I wanted to be. One of the places that I discovered on my bicycle, I mentioned Ernie Pyle as my third person on this list, was a building called the Ernie Pyle Building in Tokyo. It had been a Japanese business building of some sort, commandeered by the Americans and named for Ernie Pyle, whose name I didn't recognize, but my parents did. Ernie Pyle was a very distinguished and much-loved war correspondent who had been killed the last week of the war. And this building was named for him, and it housed the American Library in Tokyo. I could leave my bike outside, and I could go into that library, and there were all the books that I had found and read from my magnificent 100 marble-stepped library in Pennsylvania. There was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. There was The Yearling. There was The Secret Garden. And it made me connect in a way that would have taken longer had it not been for that book connection, that library connection. It brought part of my American life to what was becoming my Japanese life. Jumping ahead, New York now, 1954. Now I'm 16 years old and about to go to college. My English teacher at the small private girls' school I attended wrote on a paper of mine once, a creative writing assignment. Gave me an A. I always got A's in English, not so much sciences. She had written, "I'm sorry I've lost this. I would like to have this and frame it and put it on a wall," because she had written, "Be sure to go on writing. I think there's a chance you might do something with it." Catherine Klingon was her name. And I see that in my list of 3 words under her name, I've written lions. And for a moment I glanced at that and thought, what the heck was I thinking of about lions? But of course it was the New York Public Library. When you went to a private school in New York, of course your school had a library, but for serious study Or if you were a kid like me, you went between those lines and did your homework at the New York Public Library so that your teacher would say, be sure to go on writing. The third name, though, is Charles Philbrick at Brown University. At that time, this is no longer true, there was a special writing program at Brown to which I was admitted. They called it English Expression, and he was one of my professors, and another one who told me that I could do this, that I could be a writer. I was not good at following good advice when I was 17 and 18 years old. And when I was 19, I dropped out of that program and dropped out of Brown University and married a football player and drove across the country to California, having promised to honor and obey him forever. That was a mistake on many levels. But by 1962, which is the next list of three things, I was now 25 years old, and I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We were living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was expecting my fourth child. My husband was at Harvard Law School. We had no money. We lived in an apartment in Cambridge that cost $90 a month, if you can imagine that. That was cheap, even in 1962. I convinced my husband to babysit one night a week, and I enrolled in a Harvard extension class in writing. I still wanted to be a writer. I had just gotten sidetracked by the first baby when I was 21, and then the second baby when I was 22, and then the third baby when I was 24. And now I was pregnant with the fourth baby, and I still wanted to be a writer, and my husband said, okay, Wednesday nights. And I went off to the class in September of 1962, once a week. Baby, my son Benjamin, was born on November 5th, and I missed only that week of class. But prior to that week, the classes through September and October were so exhilarating. I would come home excited about writing again. I would take out the typewriter that my father had given me when I was 13, Smith Corona. I had taken it to college with me. I still had it. And I would work on the assignments. I would get up early in the morning, and there would be something exhilarating to think about and put words on the page. And then invariably, a baby would start to cry, or there would be footsteps coming down the hall of that crummy apartment, and there would be a child in pajamas with feet and cough medicine staining the front, and the child would say, my ear hurts, and I would put the typewriter away and go back to what really was my first task, and one that I loved. And I didn't finish the class. I went back after the baby was born. I went back the next week, thin again, suddenly, and the professor, meaning to be humorous, looked at me and said to the class, well, she's done something creative this semester. I didn't go back. I just couldn't manage it at that time. I'm jumping ahead now. It's 1972, which makes me 35 years old. By now, my husband is a lawyer in Portland, Maine. I can't do the math quickly, but in 1972, I think the kids were probably 11, 12, 14, and 15. The first name on the list is Jeopardy. The quiz program Jeopardy had just begun. It's still going, so it's been, 50 years. The kids and I used to watch that show, and I'm good at trivia, and the kids were impressed. Mom got every answer tonight. And they kept saying, Mom, look, at the end of the show, it says send a postcard if you want to be on the show. And so I did. My husband was unamused by this. Next thing I knew, they wanted me to come to New York, at my own expense, I should add, and be on the show. And so I announced to my lawyer husband that I was going to take a bus to New York and do this bizarre thing. And I did. I did not win. I was not the champion, but I didn't disgrace myself. I was ahead for most of the game until the final question, of which the category was sports. And I had fallen into a kind of euphoria because I was so far ahead, and I bet most of my money. And I answered, I don't remember how the question was phrased, but my answer was Roger Maris. Both of my sons, age 11 and 14, knew that it was Whitey Ford, and so did the other two contestants. So I left New York and took a bus back, but not before I did something I guess it isn't really that odd, but they gave each contestant, as you were leaving, a board game, a Jeopardy board game. It was not wrapped in plain brown paper. You had to walk out onto Madison Avenue carrying a huge Jeopardy game. And people pointed at you and said, she must have been and it seemed to me so embarrassing that I inched my way to a trash can and dumped my Jeopardy game, got on my bus, and went home. I had won some money, not a lot, but enough that I replaced the Smith Corona portable typewriter my father had given me when I was 13, and I bought an electric typewriter. It was still a typewriter. It wasn't anywhere near a computer, but you could plug it in, and it hummed, and it didn't require as much pressure on the keys. But something happened. I was still, when I had time, when the kids were in school, writing my short stories that nobody was interested in buying. But I began to think about, because my friends asked me, what was it like being on that quiz show? I began to think about that, and there was a bizarre and humorous element to it. And so I wrote about that. For example, when I got there to the studio, they spent a great deal of time having us, the three contestants, read pages of rules and sign various pages. But I did know that one of the things I had signed and agreed to was that I would not argue with the host. The host of that time was named Art Fleming. I must not argue with Art Fleming. I signed my name. Then the music begins to play, and the contestants walk out onto the stage and take their, at that time it was seats. I think the contestants now stand. And we sat there, and when Art Fleming took his little index cards and talked about each of the contestants the way they do, and he got to me and he misread the index card. And he said, I see you've written history books. I've never written history books. But I have signed a thing saying I won't argue with Art Fleming. So I gave a weird smile and nodded, acknowledged, yes, I've written history books, which was so completely untrue. At any rate, I wrote that into the article. And then I sent the article off to the New York Times. And to my amazement, they published it on the first page of the Arts and Leisure section of the Sunday New York Times. And next thing I knew, within a few days, agents were calling me, magazines were calling me, people were hiring me to write articles. That was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a fiction writer. But I had this new electric typewriter, and by God, people were calling me and offering to pay me money to write articles, and so that's what I did. And that brings me up to 1975, when I'm 37 years old, and Alan has just described to you that I did sell my first published short story to Redbook magazine, and the editor from Houghton Mifflin got in touch with me and said, would you consider writing a novel for young adults? That had never occurred to me, even though I had 4 young adults around my kitchen table every morning. But I agreed to do that, and I wrote the story that I'd been telling myself for many years about the death of my sister when we were both young. That was published in 1977. I was 40 years old. I had given them the manuscript without a title because I couldn't think of a title for the book. They finally called me after they had agreed to publish the book. At some point they said, excuse us, we have to have a title for this book. It's going into publication. Now I'm going to go back and add one more thing. My new typewriter, my humming electric typewriter, I bought a small table to put it on, and I found a corner in my house to place the table and the typewriter. It was a corner of the room that the kids and I all called Dad's office. There was a wall of bookcases, and there was a big important desk, and that was Dad's desk. And nobody was to use it but Dad. But I asked permission because that's what I was required to do, as most wives were in those days, ask permission for things like this. May I put a small table in the corner of your office? And he agreed, and that's where I sat and wrote my articles. I went back and told you that part because I was about to say, in the summer that I was published, right around that time, my marriage ended. And I took my typewriter my camera, my car, and my clothes, and I moved into a furnished apartment over a garage. 2 of my kids were in college, the other 2 were in high school, and they came to me on weekends. I had no money. Have I mentioned my husband was a lawyer? He represented both of us when I wanted to leave. So I was very poor, and I sat there with that typewriter working very hard. And one day, I got a phone call. I was working on my next book, A Summer to Die, had just been published. I got a phone call from a man who introduced himself as the president of the International Reading Association. And he told me that my first book had been selected. They gave that book their award, the IRA award for best first book of the year. And the ceremony would take place in Houston, Texas, and could I be there on whatever the date was? And I said, okay, yes. And then when he hung up, I called my editor at Houghton Mifflin, Walter Lorraine, and I said, this guy just called. I don't know who he was, but here's his name. And I told him I would come to Houston, Texas to receive this award. I said, I don't have enough money to buy a plane ticket to Houston, Texas. And he was the one who told me that the publishers pay for that. He flew with me. It was a very big deal. Now, we're in Houston, Texas. My editor, who's the head of children's books at Houghton Mifflin, he and I are seated at the head table, and there are 1,800 people in this room. The main speaker was Mildred Taylor, who had won the Newbery Medal that year for a book called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And she went up to the microphone. She was at the other end of the head table, and she made a very eloquent speech, during which I leaned over to my editor and said in a whisper, when they give me the award, am I supposed to go to the microphone? And he kind of went white, and he said, didn't you write a speech? And I said, no, nobody told me I was supposed to write a speech. So he said, write a speech. And I reached into my pocketbook and I had a pen. I didn't have any paper, but I took out the only piece of paper I could find, which was a bank deposit slip. I had deposited $35 in the bank in rural Maine because somebody had hired me to take a photograph and paid me $35 to do it. And so when the head of the International Reading Association called me forward and gave me a check for $1,000, I made my little speech, and I told them I was holding a bank deposit slip, and that had been my entire income the previous month. The $1,000 meant a great deal to me. I'm just remembering, too, that this is an aside. Walter Lorraine, that editor, was a literary light here some years ago, and I was asked to introduce him. I looked before I came here to see if I still had the little introduction I had written. I couldn't find it, but I know what I said, and I think it's apt and still applies. Walter, I knew after high school and before college, had been in the Navy. He had told me about that. He had been on an aircraft carrier. He was one of the guys who's out on the aircraft carrier deck with flags directing planes to come in. And so I told them that at the Literary Lights dinner, that Walter was the guy who said, come faster, move slower, tilt this way, tilt that way, you're doing pretty well, come on in. And if they don't do it right, he's the one who cleans up the mess. And that seemed to me like very good practice for being an editor. So that was my first book, and that award was my first glimpse that maybe someone like me, I had gone back to school, I did have a bachelor's degree in English. Someone like me who had no qualifications for any job, who had never worked except changing diapers, might be able to find a way to make a living doing this. It wasn't that I so loved children's literature, though I did. I had read to my kids every day of their childhood, as my mother had read to me. But what really brought it home was almost immediately the letters I began to get from readers. And I brought 2 of them that I pulled almost at random. One came in just this week because I still get these every day. But I also brought this book with me, one of the Anastasia series. Anastasia's father is a professor at Harvard, English professor, and he's also a poet, and he has several volumes of published poetry. She is, in this book, 12, and it says, One night, Dr. Krupnik had said, "There's a stack of mail on my desk that is giving me gray hair." Dad, Anastasia pointed out, "You don't have any hair." That was true. The top of his head was quite bald. "Well, my beard is getting gray from that mail. When am I ever going to find the time to answer it? I have to correct 300 exams. The publisher wants revisions on the new book." "Oh, don't worry," said her mother. "You'll get to it sometime. Those people don't expect answers." He just groaned and stroked his beard. But Anastasia had thought about it. She liked to write letters. And she never had anyone to write to because nobody ever wrote to her. So the next day, using her father's portable typewriter, she had answered all of his letters. To the man in Des Moines who had sent 3 poems asking Dr. Krupnik to read them and give his opinion, Anastasia wrote, "Dear Mr. Covington, I read all of your nice poems. They are very nice. They are not as good as mine, but that is because I have worked a long time at it and I'm quite famous. Maybe if you work at it some more, yours will be better in the future. I certainly hope so." A girl had written a very peculiar letter from San Francisco. The letter said that Myron Krupnik's love poems had really spoken to where she was at, and she thought they had kindred souls, and she would like to spend some time with him if he was ever in San Francisco. Anastasia answered her, "Dear Lisa, I am a married man with 2 adorable children. I never go to San Francisco. Thank you anyway." A librarian in Detroit had written that Dr. Krupnik's new book was very popular in her library. "It was amazing," she wrote, "how often people checked it out." Anastasia answered the librarian, "I don't think it's amazing at all. It is, after all, one of the finest collections of poetry published in the 20th century. I wish you would suggest to them, though, that they buy the book. I don't make any money when they take it out of the library, but if they buy it, I get 10%. Those are fictional fan mail answers. Here are 2 real ones. And this is the one that just came this week. This is from an adult. The book she's referring to is the 3rd book in the Giver Quartet. It's a book called Messenger. There is a character in the book, a 14-year-old girl who has been born with a twisted leg. She appears in the previous book as well. She walks leaning on a stick. She has difficulty walking. Also in this 3rd book, there is a boy who has discovered he has a gift of healing, and he tells the girl that he can heal her leg. This woman writes, "I have cerebral palsy that affects me from the waist down, and I began reading your books while my classmates attended gym class. Your stories transformed into something beautiful. It was no longer a reminder that I couldn't move like they could, but an opportunity for me to escape into the worlds you created. Perhaps the most profound gift you gave me was this line from Kira to Maddie, when she says, 'I will go with you, but I will go as I am, with my leg, with my stick.' I read that and began to cry. Your words served as a powerful reminder for 11-year-old me that my unsteady legs did not make me less than. I was whole, and my disability was an inextricable, beautiful part of who I was. Thank you for not erasing her disability and for writing the first character I could see myself in as a child." That's the kind of letter that makes you realize the importance of what you do and what you new writers are doing to give people the gift of seeing themselves in literature. The second letter that I added here is from a child. It has no punctuation. Wow. This is what English teachers call a run-on sentence. I love the book about Anastasia because she always has to take care of her brother when her mother goes to work and she has to change his diapers and feed him, and her dad is never around to help either, so it is all just her, and she's only a kid, but it makes me laugh and laugh. The interesting thing is, none of what she describes is in the book. The child in the book, Anastasia, has a baby brother. Her mother doesn't work. Her father is there. Nobody makes her take care of the baby, but this child is putting herself into the book, seeing her own life reflected there, and is able to laugh at her circumstances. And I'm at the end of my chronology, but I will mention that I read quite recently, as a result of being invited to come here, I reread Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own and was reminded of how important the space is. I try now, wherever I live, to carve out a space, but I remember that little table with my humming electric typewriter in a little corner of Dad's office. And I remember all those years when it was so hard to find a place for myself. I remember also what it was like to be so poor and to wonder whether I could make a living. I don't think I mentioned that first book, when the editor wrote to me and said, would you consider writing a book for Houghton Mifflin? And I did, and they published it. The advance for that book was under $2,000. I was very, very poor. Virginia Woolf pointed out that a woman writer needs a space and an income. More than that, needs to be acknowledged as valuable. I'm on planes a lot. Every time I'm on a plane, there's somebody sitting next to me, and we usually begin talking. And once it was a violinist from the Cincinnati Symphony. More often it's a biochemist or a stockbroker or a lawyer. Very often it's a lawyer. And then they turn to me and say, what do you do? And I say, a writer, and they brighten because that's an interesting profession. And they say, what do you write? And I say, I write children's books. And they say, oh, cute. And they pick up their magazine because it's not interesting to them, because they don't value it, because they think you write books about talking animals and they're cute. When I was thinking about that and of describing that to you, I realized that out of my many, many books that I have published, I've written 2 about talking animals. And I have brought them with me tonight, and I'm going to read the first paragraph of each. This first one, every character in this book is a mouse. It's beautifully illustrated by Eric Roman, whom I had never met, but he called me at one point and said, is it okay if I put clothes on the mice? Because otherwise they all look alike. So I gave him permission, and the mice are clothed. Chapter 1 begins, Hildegard sighed, a loud, squeaking, outraged sort of sigh, when she was informed that a new litter of mouselets had been born in the sexton's closet. Such bad timing, such bad placement. She scurried from the sacristy, the private room where Father Murphy's special priestly clothes were stored. She'd been napping there comfortably until Roderick, with his whiskers twitching, woke her with the news. Oh, he was a busybody, no question, always looking for a reaction. Well, he got one this time. She was furious. Another litter of mouse. Okay, that's the mouse book. Here, and this is very timely. This is a book about a dog. Walter Lorraine found a wonderful illustrator whom I've never met, but it's a perfect cover. I was born in the gutter and grew up in poverty, abandoned by my parents, stealing and begging in order to survive. Then, through chance and circumstance, combined with, forgive my immodesty, a keen wit and a glorious appearance, I rose to grand heights of fame and affluence. My story sounds familiar. Perhaps I remind the reader of J.D. Vance. No, I made that up. It actually says, perhaps I remind the reader of someone who might once have run for high political office. So, this book was published years ago.
Thank you very, very much. We're grateful for your taking the time to join us tonight. Lois, we're grateful for you gifting us with your wit and your insights about children's and young adult genres. You give the most exciting and riveting non-written speech ever. So thank you for that. I'd also like to, before we go, congratulate Danielle for completing her residency. And I want to welcome Yssis. We cannot wait to hear how your story ends. And I also want to thank Alan for doing this work for so many years and doing it so wonderfully and creating such an incredible program. And I want to thank our anonymous investor. Loving what you do has been the inspiration for her to commit to this work, and we're incredibly grateful for that. Good night, and thank you so much.